Hey everybody, I wanted to show you this behind me. Callie's been growing this 300-year-old variety of apple tree for probably 3 or 4 years now, straight from a little sapling. Isn't it beautiful? Today it's my job to prune it down. Let's get started. Now, before you get all angry at me for picking a fight with a tree, you need to understand I'm not fighting the tree. I love this tree. In fact, I'm keeping it healthy because this fruit tree doesn't actually bear fruit. You see, grow them from a sapling into a big tree like this, the tree actually doesn't produce fruit until you graft a branch that does produce fruit into it. You see this knot right here? A few years ago, Callie actually took this branch from another tree that does produce fruit and cut it into the tree that she grew. Now this branch will produce fruit. The issue is that all of the other branches, they were sucking all sorts of energy from the tree, but they weren't producing anything. And so now that all of those branches are gone, now this tree can focus its energy into what is actually going to produce fruit. Our lives are kind of like that. You've allowed Jesus to prune you in all sorts of different places so that you may produce fruit. You don't want to be putting all of your energy into something that produces absolutely nothing, and same with this tree right here. We most naturally begin to produce fruit when we obey the voice of the Holy Spirit.